Okay, folks, we're back with another tabletop paper and pen module for you. This one's extremely important, and this may not be seen anywhere else by you guys, but this is my concept of the current world political spectrum. And this is not touching on the deeper, more esoteric New World Order type stuff. This is with our political mainstream and political science and philosophy views, accepting that the current system is legitimate and what we know about everything is legitimate, which, of course, that's all in question, but this is going to vary quite a bit from what you normally see, and I threw this together really quick tonight. So I'm sorry for it not being a perfect piece of art for you. You're going to see and hear a lot of things that are going to differ vastly from what you think you know and what they currently are starting to teach. So let's begin. Let's try to crack into this one. So what you're going to see here is our spectrum, and you're going to notice two arches. Got my handy pointer here. We got our two arches. And what those are the actual political feelings of the people. And this big arch here, big steep arch there, contains your so-called left and right, which has been bastardized. Same thing with down here. This is our anarchy arc right here, with our pure unfettered anarchy at the bottom. You see we have a left and a right schism, a left and a right schism. Now that schism theoretically cuts straight down the middle, but you'll see that this is weighted a little bit, and this big swath right here are what we consider our moderates, centrist, milquetoasts, non-politicals. It's basically just the masses. And you will see that there's a wide band at the top, and as you get down to anarchy, there's very, very few people that support true anarchy. And we're going to shatter a lot of misconceptions about some of these systems tonight. Now, what are all these? And this down here. I'm going to explain that as quickly as I can here in a way that is explainable to the lay person. So these are not necessarily saying that the mass of the people tends to these systems. I put those in there because those are the so-called outmoded systems, but as systems, they never really go away. There's still elements of them in everything, and those are really there to line up with our benchmarks, which we're going to talk about. So we have tribalism, theological state, feudalism, and despotism. Now, I have them arranged like that because tribalism is one of the ultimate ancient left forms of government. Tribalism is essentially a form of communism or socialism, and usually they do appoint a leader, but not always. Theological state, I put on the left because the theological state, even if there is a party at the top or a theocratic leadership at the top, it still needs the participation of the people for its legitimacy. The people actually have to subscribe to that religious belief to make the state function. You simply cannot have an ISIS without Islam and Muslims following. I hope you get where I'm coming from with that. Why are feudalism and despotism on the right? Feudalism the power accumulates in few hands, that hold the land, and those that have basically warriors or soldiers. And it's sublet down, and it's a tiered society. So that fits in more with your right-wing, supposedly, system. Despotism is kind of a catch-all, but it tends to be one leader at the top, and that leader is usually, a nepotist and assigns his favorites into power. So it also becomes a heavily so-called right-wing system. And those were the ancient systems that covered most everything besides your ancient societies in antiquity, particularly in the Mediterranean, for a very, very long time. But a lot of aspects of those systems still exist today, and they will return at some point. As you can see in any so-called dark age, those systems make a reappearance, because that is the default of humanity in terms of political systems. So why do we have nationalism and fascism in there? Now, this is going to be very surprising to you, because most people consider fascism as a right-wing ideology. Most people consider nationalism as a right-wing ideology. Completely false. Absolutely false. I have never seen such a misguided thing pitched as truth. And this has actually changed in recent times. So why are nationalism and fascism included in this whole system? Nationalism is a method used to basically corral the populace and bolster their support. You can't just have a purely nationalist state without some other system. And if you look at, say, World War II, you had communist states that had nationalism and nationalist propaganda, bursting at the seams. The motherland and all that stuff. I mean, come on, you're lying to yourself if you don't think the left can use nationalism, or there's nationalist tendencies in left-wing governments. It's just in today's era, nationalism has been forced into a so-called right-wing ideology. But what you will see is that the nationalism arc does cover more ground on your right wing. That's because modern right-wing folks who tend to be in these parties are more nationalist. That's just the way that it is. And a lot of modern lefties are not nationalists at all. Matter of fact, they're, I would say, anti-nationalist. Fascism. Now this one's going to really surprise you. You're going to see that fascism has more of a presence on the left wing than it does on the right. And indeed, many fascist societies have been left-leaning. And that's going to go against everything that you've been taught. And we are going to really crack open that one here in a minute. But fascism kind of peters out when you get to any type of voluntarism or libertarianism, or even like your original concept of the U.S. And we will discuss that shortly when we cover fascism as well. What we see at the bottom, we see our crisis or catalyst line. This is the line demarcating crisis or catalyst. Now, what that's signifying is that to go from one of these systems to an anarchist type system, there almost always has to be a crisis or a catalyst. And to go from a anarchist type system back to one of these, there is almost always a crisis or catalyst. I can't think of many cases at all where that is not the case. And these are the type of entities that are going to bring about that left-wing crisis and re-standardization, let's call it, for lack of a better term right now. Normalization, I think they would call it in subversion terms. Dictators, strongmen, warlords, bureaucrats, educators, trade unions, and party members. Radicals, militias, religious figures. I know you guys probably can't see that very well, and I apologize. You know, I'm in the Stone Age technologically, and I do that on purpose. Number one, because I don't have the time to make flashy edited videos with clickbait. And number two, I like to be as authentic and as genuine as possible. You can see that I made this, tonight with my own hand and my own mind. Down here are your entities that are going to typically bring a more right-leaning catalyst or crisis. Kings, emperors, dictators, strongmen, military juntas, nobility, wealthy, oligarchs, and of course, radicals, militias, and religious figures. Now, one thing a lot of people are not familiar with is anarchy is not a purely left-wing ideology, nor is it a purely right-wing ideology. Nor is anarchy chaos. In school, they teach you that anarchy is chaos. That's absolutely, patently untrue. Complete brainwashing. But we should not fall for the anarchist brainwashing either. So let's touch on that a little bit more. So you have anarcho-syndicalism, which is more of a left-wing anarchist ideal. You have anarcho-capitalism, which is more of a right-leaning anarchist ideal. Now, my thoughts on anarchy are pretty complicated. The anarcho-syndicalists, as far as I can tell, believe in groups similar to trade unions controlling means of production and wealth to ensure a free society. And there would be typically no government control in its purest sense. But the problem is when trade unions have taken over the means of production and the means of capital, that is a de facto communist party or communist state, and it will become such. And that can be proven out by history, by the way, and we'll touch on that as well. Anarcho-capitalism takes the freedom of anarchy but stresses the values of capitalism. And the problem with capitalism, well, a system that has worked better than any other and allows mobility, it also allows the wealthy to become oligarchs. And once you have any type of oligarch in a society that has no structure, crisis and catalyst will present itself, folks. And then you're going to move up into one of these systems. And more than likely, it's going to be despotism, fascism, possibly even neo-feudalism, which is what they're aiming for. But that's enough on that for the moment. Let's continue to look at this. So, we have our left-right schism at the top here. And you'll notice this little red tapering right here. Little red spot on the left schism. And this is another thing a lot of people don't understand. A lot of these so-called neocons, they hold a lot of left sympathist policies, or at least fire on the same cylinders as the leftists on a lot of issues to stay into moderate support and some of these neocons aren't even really right-wing, so to speak. And they don't really hold true conservative belief. Actually, pretty much none of the neocons do. Real conservative is actually fiscally conservative and does not want to wage war in every country on planet Earth. So, I place the typical Republican right about here. And above the typical Republican, we're going to see the real conservative Republican group grow at the top here. And this is where I put the ancient republic benchmark. So it's actually very complicated to compare what we have as a so-called republic, which is what we have is not a true republic anymore, folks. But to try to compare what we have now to an ancient republic is very difficult. The ancient republics did not have something such as the executive branch per se. If we look at ancient Rome, the Senate elected 2 consuls, and their term was very short, and they rotated out. So while the republic was strong, they actually did have conservative, rigid Republican belief. They really did. If you really dig into Roman history, a lot of blood was spilt to maintain the republic. And the original Romans, far from what you see in the movies and fictional accounts, when you're talking the later kingdom years into the peak of the republic, they were actually quite moral people in some regards. Now, don't twist my words. They did have slaves and all of that, but I'm saying in terms of their family structure and their sense of duty and the sense of belonging to a citizenry and a republic, they actually were quite rigid. And for quite some time, they did actually fiscally succeed quite well. So I put the real conservatives kind of shrouding that ancient benchmark, but they did fight pretty fiercely to keep themselves from falling into tyranny. You couldn't ever dream of calling yourself a king. And even when Augustus came to power as the first emperor, he really went to great lengths to make people feel like the republic was still alive. And if you want to study realpolitik, Augustus is a major figure to look at. I mean, he wove quite the web. And a lot of people felt as if the republic still existed during his reign, which eventually went to total tyrannical emperors, and we saw the fruits of that. So we have this real conservatives group coming here, and at the very top end, very minor majority, would be your constitutionalists. And the scary part is your constitutionalists are branded as right-wing extremists in today's society. And really, they just seek to follow the literal interpretation of the Constitution and the founding documents. And then within this group here, that group right there, guess what that is, folks? That is the original liberty concept of the U.S. Republic. Shocking to see it so far to the right. But that is absolutely the case. Absolutely 100%. And you know what? There's a little bit of element of fascism in every system besides anarchy. But you see a strong showing of nationalism, tiny bit of fascism, but much more right-wing Republican orientated, and a very strong stress on personal liberties. And you see this party right here, is your Libertarian Party. Libertarians are mostly enshrouded by the original U.S. concept, constitutionalists, and there are some voluntarists. Far at the bottom here, I know you're not going to be able to read this, so I'm going to tell you what it is. That is your so-called sovereign citizens. Your sovereign citizens are extreme right-wing, and they're very close to that anarchism. And while I kind of applaud some people for standing up, it's kind of foolish to say that you're sovereign from the U.S. as an entity, and a lot of these laws don't apply to you because your real name is a fictional entity, but they still do want to use all the infrastructure and still do plead their case in the system. And if you wanted to truly be a sovereign citizen, you'd have to be a complete outlaw, a total outlaw if you wanted to be a sovereign. And you can't really see any extreme left-wing sovereigns because left-wing ideas in general encroach on private freedom. And that's what sovereignty is all about. I guess you could have a wingnut that was a communist and wanted to be alone, but I've never seen one. So don't get mad at me if you think I got that wrong. So let's take a look over at our Democrat side. And you'll see the Democratic Party cuts a wider swath than your Republican Party. This is kind of rolled to the left over the years. Rolled over. So now we got the Republican Party more of leaning towards the left, and the Democratic Party leaning towards the extreme left. So this is where your typical milquetoast Democrat lies. And then we're going to look at the ancient democracy benchmark right here. And then you got your so-called democratic socialism, which is really just socialism and communism light. Then you have socialism and communism. And I apologize if you guys can't read these. That's why I'm announcing them all to you. And of course it comes back right around to our anarchism schism. So let's talk about those a little bit. Why is our ancient democracy benchmark where it is? If you draw a line down through these outmoded systems, you're going to see it cuts a path between tribalism and theological state. And that is 100% the case with ancient Greek democracies, which, as far as I know, ancient Greece and some very small island-type societies are really the only true democracies we've ever seen. And while some of them did succeed, it's not a lasting system. And the U.S. was never intended to be a democracy. I hate when I hear people say our democracy, because we are not a democracy. We are a republic. You need to know the difference. You're being hornswoggled by the elites that use democracy as a buzzword to make you feel free. So why were the ancient democracies between tribalism and theological states? Because in those ancient democracies, like we discussed earlier, tribalism is basically a communist or socialist system. It's the tribe as a unit. Everyone has their place in the tribe. Everyone contributes. Everyone benefits from the tribe. Theological state is because in your ancient Greek democracies, they had two things ruling: the mass of the people and the gods. And that's why I put that like that. Because if you go back and you read any of the ancient Greek and Roman literature that covers Greek societies, you'll see that the gods were consulted, the gods were heeded, and after they were consulted, the body of the people made the decisions. So our ancient democracy benchmark cuts kind of through tribalism and theological state, and of course, it also cuts strongly through nationalism. And why does it cut through nationalism? Because the ancient democracies were fiercely nationalistic. Fiercely. I mean, all you got to do, folks, is go read some history on the Peloponnesian War to see what kind of nationalism was going on in Greece. So, democratic socialism is socialism or communism light. Take some socialism, add the democratic buzzword onto it, and you got a bunch of morons that have a system that's bound to crush itself under its own weight as it tries to cater to everyone's need with a decreasing amount of taxpayers and tax base. It's all being squandered away. And then you have socialism, which is basically the government enforcing socialistic policies. And, you know, it's a little bit less absent the thinly veiled ability of the people to have a say. And you can't really have a democratic socialist system anyways, folks, because the mass of the people is almost always going to vote for more freebies. And this is something that's been understood for a long time. And then you have communism. Communism, it's encompassed partially by the Democratic Party. There are quite a few communists now that are Democrats, and vice versa. Communism is where they actually have the balls to step up and say the government's going to control it all. And supposedly the idea is everyone gets their fair shake, but really all communism ever does is makes everyone equally poor, besides the party elite. That's how it always seems to work, folks. And we're going to have whole discussions on why communism does not work and why communism is a more flawed model than capitalism, albeit all of them are flawed. And as you see, once we conclude this video, there is no other assumption than every system is flawed and will fail. And there's no way around that. The closest thing to a way around that is an involved, educated, and moral populace. But that's not going to happen anytime in the near future. So, let's talk about fascism. For crying out loud, we need to talk about fascism. The word is used liberally, and everyone is called a fascist. And we need to clear this up. Fascism is not a right-wing ideology. It is just not. You cannot even find a set definition on fascism anywhere anymore. So fascism, the root of the word comes from the fasces, which was the bundle of sticks with an axe in the center that was presented as a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. The reason an ancient Roman symbol was used to represent fascism is via Mussolini, who was considered the founder of so-called fascism. But there were many other fascist examples to go from. And of course, the most famous is Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. And that brings in an interesting topic, folks. So if you want to see a more right-wing fascism, you would have to look at Francoist Spain. That was a little bit more right-wing. If you want to look at a left-wing fascism, you need only look at Nazi Germany. The Nazi Party were nationalist and socialist. It's the National Socialist Party. And the real term is much, much longer and in German, and German confuses the hell out of me. So we're just going to call it the National Socialist Party because that's what it was. And there was a strong element of socialism in German society, which if you read any books, you would know, but they are very clever in trying to gloss all that over in your history books. You see, because your history books are not teaching you real history. Not at all. So, fascism. It can go left, it can go right. What was the original definition in all the old books on this? If you look at all the old literature on fascism, it was defined as the combination of corporate and government powers. Let that sink in. That's what it used to be defined as. And now, if you look at the definition of it, there's this muddled, confused, helter-skelter definition available that basically says it's a right-wing nationalist ideology, and that is not accurate in the least. Fascism is basically the nationalization of the major corporations, the major utilities, and basically everything that's integral to life. So there is authoritarian top-down control by default. And yes, it's usually headed by an authoritarian leader that puts this all into motion. But it is essentially a merger of every aspect of life with government power. And the reason they tend to be nationalist is when you have that much control within a nation, you need to foster a sentiment of nationalism, especially if you can focus that nationalism on an external threat or an external enemy, or the building up of the military to defend against so-called external threats. So it's not that fascism is all those things as a definition. It's that the fascist system basically precipitates all of those things. It becomes a requirement to keep it running, to have everything nationalized, to pump a strong military, to pump nationalism, to pump external threats. And that's exactly what Germany did. It's exactly what Mussolini did. It's exactly what they tried to do in Spain, and succeeded for the most part, although you hear a lot less about Franco at Spain than you do Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy. So, yeah, it just drives me crazy when you see people on the left calling anyone on the right a fascist. And what they don't realize is, number one, we live in a country that has turned fascist already. It's just veiled very well. It's hidden underneath the surface extremely well. But fascism is a reality in today's America, and it's not because of Trump. This has existed for decades upon decades. We slowly became what we fought in World War II. And now it's so ingrained, and people don't even realize it. Well, let's talk about the left. If you take the modern definition of fascism, okay? Actually, let me consult Wikipedia to see what the current definition of fascism is, because it seems to just be re-edited all the time throughout history. I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. Fascism is a form of radical authoritarian ultra-nationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and of the economy, which came to prominence in early 20th century Europe. So, did you catch that hidden in there with so many words? Strong regimentation of society and of the economy. Regimentation of society and the economy, folks. Economy, merger of corporate and government power. See, the thing is, they have to do that to have total control over the society. And that's something the elites today know very well. The ultranationalism, like I said, precipitates out of the system, because when you have tight controls over everything in the country, you need to foster the belief in nationalism, especially when opposed to an external entity. And yes, fascism is authoritarian, every example we've seen, but does it really have to be? And this brings to mind something that's very interesting. If you read that definition, dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and regimentation of society and the economy, that's almost indistinguishable from the communist systems we've seen. And this goes back to Hitler in his own writings, saying that a communist can become a national socialist. So communist can become a Nazi, but a Nazi cannot become a communist. Very interesting saying that's stuck in the back of my mind for a long time, as all these idiots on the left call people on the right fascists. Because as we've established, Nazi Germany was a socio-fascist system, basically, which is what America has become today, folks. Can you not see that? And it's not a recent development either. And we can tie that into all sorts of other interesting facts like Operation Paperclip and all that, but that will be for other videos. So I want to talk about anarchy. This is the last thing we really need to attack the myth on. Now, in written history that I know of, besides, random bouts of deterioration and crisis in certain places, the only time I know where anarchy was tried explicitly as a system was during the revolution in Spain. So during the revolution in Spain, there were enough anarchists formulated into enough of a movement to create a region that was under an anarchist system. And of course, this anarchist group fought with the Republicans, or so-called Republicans, during the Spanish Civil War. And the Republicans were basically the left-wing combatants in that war. And of course, your monarchists and your Francoists and some other groups were your so-called right-wing. It was a very interesting civil war to look at because it was almost all politically based, and there were so many splintered groups and factions, and it ebbed back and forth, and it's just very interesting to study. And there's a great series that you can even find on YouTube. I think it was made in like the early 90s. It's a documentary, I think 6-part documentary on Spanish Civil War. Extremely interesting. I highly recommend that you watch that at some point. But I'm going to let you in on 2 interesting facts about the Spanish Civil War based on my studies. There was this anarchist group, and they started their own system in their own area, and they were leaning towards the left. So what did it become more like? It did not become more like anarcho-capitalism. It was more like anarcho-syndicalism. And actually, the participatory labor credit system basically ended up becoming a managed system like you would see in a communist ideology. And what happened was because the anarchist system was so weak, supposedly at the top, and because it had the system which was already reminiscent of a socialist or communist system for its labor credits, that it became subsumed by leftist parties. And it started out and it functioned for a while and then deteriorated until it was subsumed. Now I'm going to tell you another interesting story. The author that goes under the pen name George Orwell, he actually volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And the group he fought for, I believe, now remember I do all my videos off the top of my head to be authentic, give you my real opinion. It's not polished, it's not researched ahead of time. This is all stuff I picked up years ago studying this stuff. I believe he was fighting for a group called the POUM, and they were a communist group. but they were not a Stalinist or Leninist type group. They were more ideologically based. Guess what happened to that group, folks? They were subsumed by Stalinists. That's correct. The ideological communists were subsumed by the communists, the Stalinists. And that is why Orwell wrote the books that he wrote. He didn't just come up with that stuff. He watched it happen in Spain over and over again with different parties, where a man rises to the top, Big Brother, and a man consolidates control over everything and regiments everything down to the lowest order and uses assassination, propaganda, and even false flags and stuff like that to gain total power. It's actually something he saw. So that is the lost generation, in my take, on the political spectrum that we see on planet Earth today. And this is based out of my own observation, my own studies. And if you don't agree with it, that's fine. But I think if you really look into some of these ideas, you're going to find them quite accurate. And I will also have you know that I believe they've identified fascism in modern times as a right-wing philosophy or ideology because they need something really, really evil to throw over here. They need to make all these people look like pieces of crap. And if there's never been a group more deserving of looking like a piece of crap, it would be the communists. I don't know how you can study history and not think that the communists were a giant piece of steaming crap. How many tens and hundreds of millions of people have died over communism? And how many times has it been tried? And how many times has it turned from a supposed good intent to a absolutely brutal authoritarian regime that keeps everyone mired in poverty and fear? You know, you guys are fools if you think that it ever has a chance of working long term. Absolute fools. And as much as I would love to say I support anarchism and anarchy means without rulers, I can't really say that, folks, because there will be no time that you have an anarchist system and it doesn't get overtaken by some sort of more organized system. And you can say, yeah, well, you can have militias and all that, but in modern terms, I don't see it happening. And all it takes is for one strongman, one oligarch, one trade union or guild, or whoever, to throw that system into crisis. Anarchism creates a vacuum. Vacuums create basically brutal and ambitious men, and then it creates one of these systems. And when it does so, it's usually not a freedom-based system like in here. So hopefully you guys think about all this. Hopefully this is a good informative video for you. I know it's kind of long, but I tried to explain most of my points as well as possible off the cuff. As always, Lost Generation, we're out.